Hey, what's going on everybody? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to show you the process about replacing a valve cover gasket on an F30 328i. This is going to be the same process for any BMW that has an N20 or N26 powered vehicle. In this kit, we include all the gaskets you're going to need in order to do this installation successfully. As you may or may not know, valve cover gasket leaks are super common on BMWs. The rubber in the valve cover gaskets basically becomes brittle over time, allowing oil to get past the seal, and it just generally makes a huge mess, and on occasion you'll even smell burning oil. So if you do have a burning oil condition on any of these cars, you can pretty much automatically assume it is the valve cover gasket that's causing that problem. But that said, let's talk about some of the tools you're going to need to do this job successfully, and then we're going to go ahead and jump right into the video, show you how to do this. So in order to replace the valve cover gasket on your N20 powered BMW, you're going to, at minimum, need certain hand tools, but in the specific case of the F30, we're going to use a 10mm socket for removing the cowl cover, an E18 socket for removing the reinforcement brace that goes from the strut tower to the firewall, as well as one of these cool little self-expanding rivet pliers to remove the center section from it without damaging it. But outside of that, you're going to need a 17mm and a 14mm wrench or flare nut wrench for removing the high pressure and low pressure feed lines to the high pressure fuel rail and to the high pressure fuel pump itself. T30 socket for removal of the high pressure fuel pump. You're going to need an E6 external Torx, an E8 external Torx, an E10 external Torx, and that aforementioned E18. Along with that, I have this CTA super stubby T40 bit, which conveniently goes into this 12mm ratcheting wrench. That is for removal of the vacuum pump at the back of the cylinder head. There's basically no room, so this thing here comes in handy. Along with that, an inspection mirror to help you see those bolts on the vacuum pump. Used a couple of different 3/8 extensions for getting access to the external Torx fasteners for the valve cover that actually mounted to the cylinder head. Series of ratchets, flathead screwdriver and a pick. These are also useful. Torque wrench that could do 10 to 15 Newton meters in torque value. Also want a light, that's super useful to have. Shop towels for when you open up the high pressure fuel system. Want to make sure that fuel doesn't spray everywhere, so you can use this to make sure it doesn't turn into a huge mess. And if you have the option to use impact guns or electric ratchets, these are also super useful as well. But these are going to be the bare minimum tools you're going to need to do this job. So with that said, let's go and get right into it. There's actually just a lot of stuff in the way, including this cowl cover, but we're going to start off with the engine cover first, which on the earlier N20s has a vacuum canister for your wastegate actuator. So we want to make sure that we remove and disconnect our vacuum lines. Want to try to avoid pulling as much as possible. There we go. Next up, we have our sound insulation for the engine because these things sound pretty loud, a lot of ticking. All right, so next up, basically to gain access to the top of the engine, we need to remove the cowl cover. So we're going to do that next. It's this piece right here. I'm going to go ahead and start removing it. It's going to be held in with a bunch of these style rivets like this. Some of these quarter turn fasteners up here. So just go about and start removing those. But they should just be quarter turn. Once you turn it a quarter of the way, you should be able to just slowly start lifting it out of here. And then we also have these expanding rivets. And so these little pliers are really useful for getting these center sections out, like so. We also have this cross brace that I want to remove and get out of here. And then there's this cover underneath, which looks like it's held in by a bunch of 10 mils. So I have to remove some more stuff. You have these access plugs here on the windshield cowl. They gain access to the E-Torx bolts behind, and you'll be able to unbolt the cross brace and pull it out. The 4 bolts that hold the cross brace in are E18s. Next up, we want to remove this cover piece here. It's held in by several 10mm fasteners. Now we just go ahead and pull this right out, and that gives us full access to the top of our engine. So our biggest immediate thing that's in the way is our high pressure fuel injection system, our Valvetronic actuator slash sensor wiring, which is right here. High pressure fuel pump. We have also a lot of harness stuff that's in the way. Particularly in this car, we have our solenoid for our wastegate actuator, since this is pneumatic powered version. So it's just a matter of trying to get the stuff out of the way and also keeping track of where everything goes. So first and foremost, go ahead and pull our ignition coils. These do need to be removed. You can also see that the ignition coil harness is grounded to the fuel injector hold downs, which is why we have to remove these. On these ignition coils, if you find that you flip this locking tab up, if it doesn't push the connector for the ignition coil off, what you could do is squeeze the sides while flipping up, and that'll push the connector off. What sometimes happens is the side of the lock will go around the connector and just won't pop them out for you. So if you're running that problem, just keep that one in mind. Also, when removing these coils, they can be pretty stubborn sometimes. So I'll just come in here with a flathead screwdriver and I'll try to pull them out by the locking tab. You don't need to number which one goes in which cylinder, they're all the same. You can do that if you want, but it's not necessary. Next up, I'm gonna remove our vacuum solenoid. This is, like I said, for the wastegate actuator. It's held in with 2 T30 screws, so I'll bolt that and just hold it off to the side. And we can just leave our vacuum solenoid sitting down there. And what we'll do, just to be able to keep track of these smaller screws, is we will thread them back into the valve cover like they originally were. Next up, I'm going to disconnect our Valvetronic actuator connector. It's 2 tabs, just pull straight up, and then it's kind of locked or secured in place onto the valve cover here. There's another main harness over here that has a similar situation. These things, for whatever reason, they can be pretty stubborn to dislodge from the valve cover, so if you can leave them in place, that's really probably the better option. They do open, it's just a little lock for that, so if you can open them with a little pick, it's preferred. We have our connector for the high pressure fuel pump. I'm gonna move that out of the way. The grounds for the ignition coil harness are 8 mils. And my recommendation is, once you have removed those grounds, just thread the nuts back onto these studs right here so you don't lose them. Next up, we got 2 O2 sensor connectors in the rear here. They kind of just sit in a little metal bracket. You have to disconnect these. Some locking tabs are on the side of the connector. Probably not gonna be able to see it on the camera just because of the amount of space that's available here, but okay, there we go. We have this mounting bracket here in the rear. It's held down by a couple of E6 screws, so we're gonna go ahead and remove these. We're gonna need this out of the way so that we can gain access to the low pressure feed line and the high pressure feed line for the fuel system. So to give you a visual of what I was doing there, it's deceptive. You have these sort of tabs on the side, and those look like those maybe the locking releases. The locking release is actually in the front here. So I just took this pick, went down between the injector connector and pushed it down. That pushed it out, which released the little lock tab on the connector that sits right there. I was just able to pull the connector out nice and easy. It's deceptive because you would think that, you know, this right here is a lock. It's not. Really don't know what that is. I think it's just there to mess with you. Now at this point, because we disconnect everything, all the electrical connectors that would normally be going here are out of the way. The nice thing to note is you do not need to remove the fuel injectors to do this. This is a recessed area here. This is the cylinder head. The valve cover actually goes around it entirely. What we do need to do is release these feed lines from the high pressure fuel rail going to the fuel injectors. And we also need to remove the high pressure fuel pump because that bolts to the top of the cylinder head, and obviously you can see the valve cover goes entirely around it, so this would be in the way. Word of caution when opening up a high pressure fuel system, There's going to be some pressure in there. You want to slowly crack the lines. You want to have the line covered with a rag. In this case, these flare nuts are 17 mil. Right here, this is our high pressure feed line going to the fuel rail. I'm going to release pressure from here first. And you're going to hear fuel coming out. But the key here is just keep a rag over the top while you're loosening this. Keep the line covered. Keep a rag over it. And wear some safety glasses. You don't want high pressure fuel to shoot you in the eye. I'm going to release the line from up here, 17 again. There should be no pressure in the high pressure fuel rail anymore, since I released it from the high pressure side of the fuel pump. As you can see, fuel did come out of the fuel rail. It wasn't under any kind of pressure. That was just fuel that was sitting in the rail. So just basically emptied back up. Keep a rag there, try to soak it up. But before we pull the valve cover, we're going to do a quick spray down in this area anyway to remove any kind of dirt or contamination. Next up, we're going to be removing the low pressure feed for the high pressure fuel pump. This is not as much of a problem in terms of the potential for fuel to spray. But do expect some kind of fuel to come out, so try to capture as much of it with a rag as you can. Okay. Now that that's done, we can go and remove the high pressure fuel pump. We can do this in quarter turns, just helping with these T30 fasteners. The reason why I'm doing this in quarter turns is the high pressure fuel pump is going to be under compression from the camshafts. This is driven off the exhaust cam. And what I don't want to do is put pressure on any one particular side. I just want to try to remove this as evenly as possible. And as I go back and forth, you see that the fuel pump does move back and forth as well. I'm just trying to keep as much pressure off as I can. And there's our high pressure fuel pump. Put that off to the side. Part of this, we need to remove our high pressure fuel rail. It is held down by two caps. They're both held down by two E8 Torx screws. So we're gonna go ahead and remove those. Then we'll disconnect the feed line to the fuel injectors, and we'll get the high pressure fuel rail out of the way. Use a 14mm wrench to crack the feed lines for the fuel injectors. Should come loose pretty easily. They're not really that tight. There's gonna be some fuel that leaks out. All you can really do is try to get as much of it as you can with a rag. You don't have to worry about pressure at this point because we already opened the high pressure side and relieved any pressure that could be there. So we're good on that front. All right, those are loose. And we're gonna go ahead and put our fuel rail off to the side here. We have the vacuum line from the brake booster to the vacuum pump. You have these two little tabs on the side. You just depress them and pull it off. It might be a little difficult to remove, but just whatever you do, be very gentle with it. You don't want to break it. Breaking it would suck. So just be somewhat gentle with it while you're removing it. And there's 3 screws that hold our vacuum pump on the back side. I do need to remove the vacuum pump in order to remove the valve cover. So unfortunately, I'm going to be working blind on this one. So unfortunately, on removal of the vacuum pump, you're not going to be able to see anything. We do have a in-depth video that explains how to remove the vacuum pump. What I'm doing differently is I'm using one of these stubby T40 from CTA. All you do is use a 12mm wrench. In this case, I'm using a ratcheting wrench. And it kind of gives you a very low profile to get in there. And we have one last E6 Torx bolt that we have to remove. which allows us to remove the bracket, which allows us access to start moving the valve cover. And all of that is blocked by the vacuum pump. Next up, we want to remove our Vanos actuators. They're held on by E6 Torx bolts. And these just pull right out, nothing special. We'll disconnect them, keep these in a clean place. So the valve cover is held on with a series of E10 Torx screws. Just gonna break them all free at first. So there's a lot of wiggling that I had to do to get the valve cover off. It seemed like what happened is the screws wanted to reseat themselves back down into the holes. So I just kind of had to work it back and forth, making sure that the screws hadn't somehow re-secured themselves into the threads. And then you have this, basically this positive battery cable that comes from this junction across. Just had to get it past that and also make sure it doesn't get held up on the major battery cable in the back here and the low pressure feed line. So from this point, just got to swap over the gaskets, check the straightness of the valve cover. Now's also a good time to check tension on the chain, since N20s are known for having timing chain problems. We have a video explaining that. But really, it's all about cleanup and making sure that the mating surface for the valve cover is as clean as it can be. So just taking clean, dry rags and just gonna go around the perimeter of the cylinder head here where the gasket seats, and make sure that we don't have any oil or debris that's gonna prevent the gasket from sealing. So we're gonna swap out the valve cover gasket. In this case, this is actually a newer valve cover gasket. We're doing the DIY in this car out of convenience since we have access to it. So there's actually nothing wrong with this gasket, but normally when these gaskets go bad, they are rock hard. And like I said earlier, it's the deterioration of the gasket material over time and the exposure to heat and oil that causes this rubber to dry up and get brittle and eventually cause a leak. If you look at the gasket from the side, you can see that there's a lower portion, there's a higher portion. You want to keep the higher portion down and the thinner portion up top. Technically, the gasket will not seat properly if you try to do it any other way. But what it should look like once it's installed is the gasket that fills the little recess here in the cylinder head, or the cylinder head cover. It should look basically flush. Same thing for when you're putting the new valve cover gasket on. There's a little notch over here, and you'll see that there's like a little groove on the outside of the gasket. And so you're basically just trying to line that up. And then once you find that on the new gasket, you just basically insert it as you go around the perimeter. And all you're trying to do, like I said, is just make sure that the gasket seats nicely. You shouldn't have to force it into place. If you have to force the curvature, that means the gasket's alignment is slightly off. But if you lined it up properly, these little tabs on the gasket will line up with the notches in the valve cover. All right, next up, we're gonna replace the vacuum pump seal. Just gonna use the screwdriver to pry it out. Shouldn't be in there too tight, but exercise some level of caution. If it's not coming out, you don't wanna pry too hard, because this is a plastic valve cover and you can end up buying a new one that way. There we go. Yeah. The new one should be able to just press in with your fingers. Should just slide in very nicely like that. Next up, on top of the valve cover, we have our Valvetronic motor seal. Actually, I'm going to remove that, not replace it. We will replace it once the valve cover is back on the engine. Reason being is I don't want to get the connector stuck in here, so we'll leave that alone. Also pull off our high pressure fuel pump seal, We'll replace that once the valve cover is back on the engine. The last gasket that we have actually goes on our crankcase ventilation line. It's that O-ring right there, so just gonna pull that off and replace it now. Often the time these go unreplaced, which could result in a potential vacuum leak, so I do want to replace these. Since it does come with the kit, there's no reason not to. The O-ring should just slide into place, like so. All right, so we went ahead and cleaned the mating surface. And now comes the delicate process of getting the valve cover back into position without knocking the gasket out. You do not want to dislodge the gasket. That would be terrible because that will leak. Oh yeah. So at this point, if you have an inspection mirror, just go around the outside and make sure that the gasket has not rolled or dislodged itself in some unfortunate way. All right, we're gonna go ahead and tighten these screws back down. Not trying to drive the valve cover down this way. I'm just trying to get the gasket to start seating, and I'm working from the inside out. So BMW has kind of a goofy torquing sequence. We're gonna move from the outside to the inside. Torque spec is 9 Newton meters. So at this point, I'm just gonna go ahead and put our crankcase vent hose back on. That new O-ring, it might be kind of hard to lock into place, but it will go on. Just need to make sure that it bottoms out and the locking tabs lock, which they did. I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall our cam adjust magnets. They only go on one way. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, you cannot get replacement O-rings for those. Don't know why that is, you just can't. I'm gonna tighten these E6 Torx bolts back down. There is a torque spec on these, however, it is a very tiny self-tapping screw. It does not need a lot of torque, it'll bottom out. And that's pretty much all you need to do. The O-ring is what creates the seal. You don't need to go crazy with it. Also, these ratcheting E-Torx ratchets or wrenches are super useful on this job. So I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna wait to put our Valvetronic motor seal back on. I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. And it will slide down over the motor like so. And then you just go ahead and put your E6 Torx bolts back in. If you want, you can put a little bit of oil on the inside, but it should just slide down, no problem at all. And we'll also go right ahead and just put on our new high pressure fuel pump gasket. Again, look for the alignment tab. The alignment tab is in the back here, and there's a little notch on the valve cover for where that goes. If you purchased a new valve cover, it would already come with this seal pre-installed. However, that does not come with a vacuum pump seal. You do have to buy that separately, which is why we have the kit. So our next step, we're gonna go ahead and bring our electrical housing back into location. Before we reinstall the vacuum pump, have to do this first. If you put the vacuum pump back on before you do that, you're gonna be very upset with yourself. So do that first. Also worth noting over here, there's a little alignment dowel on this plastic backing. You do wanna make sure that that alignment dowel is sitting flush before trying to put these screws back in, because you might find that these screws don't want to go back in and the thing is not sitting flush. It'd be because of that. When you go to reinstall the vacuum pump, one thing I didn't mention when I took it off is make sure you don't move this drive mechanism. This engages with the camshaft. If you do subsequently move it, it might make it difficult to line back up Basically, if you do not mess with this when you pull it back off, you can go ahead and reinsert the vacuum pump pretty easily and it shouldn't line up. Alternatively, you might have to wiggle it around just to get it to engage. But what it should do is it should just line up and go right into place. And then just a matter of lining up these dowels. And then once that's lined up, it's just a matter of putting those screws back in, which you have to feel that whole situation out. So wish me luck. That's good. Oh my God, and it dropped in. The key takeaway is if it's lined up properly, it will just drop into place. You won't have to fight it. And as a reminder, the bolt size is T40. Now the vacuum pump is in, just hook up your vacuum line for the brake booster. Don't want to forget that. Before you put your high pressure fuel pump back on, make sure that all of your wiring leads here are not buried underneath the hose for the low pressure feed to the high pressure fuel pump. If these were to be trapped underneath, it would make plugging everything back in a huge pain. So just make sure that you don't have any conflict going on there. So here's our high pressure fuel pump. Pretty much it will just drop into place. One thing to note on high pressure fuel pump installation, if the engine was turned off with the exhaust cam putting lots of pressure on the high pressure fuel pump, you do not want to use the screws to force the high pressure fuel pump to depress the cam follower back into place, or basically to depress the plunger on the high pressure fuel pump. What you'd want to do is put a socket on the crankshaft bolt and bar the engine over so that the cam follower is in a lower position. You don't want to force this thing back down into place. You could break the high pressure fuel pump doing that, so just be aware of it. That's just one of those things you'd have to do manually. There's no way to check for that beforehand. Unbolting it is not as much of a problem, but reinstalling it like that could potentially cause a problem with the high pressure fuel pump, so avoid doing that at all costs. When installing the high pressure fuel pump back onto the cylinder head, make sure you use these updated bolts that have thread sealant on them. The originally installed bolts didn't have thread sealant. Oil can come past these threads, and then you have a bunch of random oil sitting around the high pressure fuel pump, which could be misdiagnosed as a bad gasket or something like that. So just use these new bolts with thread sealant. Final torque, once you've bottomed out the fuel pump onto the cylinder head, is 12 Newton meters. Similar to how you remove it, you just basically turn the bolts a little bit at a time. BMW recommends 90-degree turns for each bolt at a time. However, if the high pressure fuel pump cam follower is all the way at the bottom, I don't really see why you would necessarily need to do that. You should try to tighten it down evenly. Just gonna put the flare nut back on. Torque spec for this flare nut fitting is 13 Newton meters plus or minus 3. Also, you'd have to use a crow's foot to properly tighten it with a torque wrench. Alternatively, you don't have a Torx wrench, choke up on your 17 millimeter wrench. And all you're really gonna do here is bottom the nut out against the fuel pump. So basically what's gonna happen is the nut is gonna stop spinning. Once you're choked up on it, if you can't move it any further without a significant amount of force, it's done. Basically, the line is bottomed out in the high pressure fuel pump. The nut is securing the ball fitting or the ball flare into the high pressure fuel pump. That's what creates the seal. So next up, we're going to reinstall the high pressure fuel rail. And kind of like loosely put it into place and then get these flare nuts started on the new injectors. Now that we got the injectors tight to the fuel rail, we'll reinstall this retaining, or these retainers for the fuel rail. These are held on by E8 Torx bolts. And now, I can get that to go in. There we go. So reinstalling the high pressure feed line from the high pressure fuel pump to the fuel rail. Again, this is 13 Newton meters plus or minus 3, AKA you're just gonna snug it up with a wrench if you do not have a crow's foot. The key on these is not to kill it because it's the flare fitting on the line that makes the seal. Next up, I'm gonna reinstall our ignition coils. You'll notice these little tabs here on the cylinder head. That's where these little grommets go. You're just gonna kind of push these down until they bottom out. You kind of feel them pop into place. And while we're there, we're going to reinstall our injector connectors. In terms of which one goes where, you know, injector number 1 is the forward portion, injector number 2 is the rearward. So kind of logical in terms of which one goes where. You'll hear them kind of click into place. And then for our ignition coils, similar situation. They kind of just go the direction they want to go. So it's just a matter of just plugging them back in. You know, make sure that the connector fully seats. And then put the lock tab down, and then we'll reinstall our ground. Next up, we're going to reinstall the boost solenoid. So after doing this job, before you put everything back together and you put the engine cover back on, go ahead and start the car. Check for leaks. Obviously at the fuel feed lines and at the fuel rail and at the high pressure fuel pump, you want to make sure that there's no leaks before you put it back together and then find out later on. Also note that when you go to crank the car, it's not going to start right away. Obviously, because the fuel system has been open, it's going to take a little bit longer for the engine to start. Basically, the high pressure fuel pump being completely bone dry, it's going to have to push out all that air before it can start. So you're going to notice that it's going to take a little bit longer for it to start. That's totally normal. There's no special bleeding procedure for this. Just let the engine crank, it'll start. If it's taking too long, just hit the start button again to basically stop the cranking. Then hit the start button again and it'll probably start right up. Yeah, like I said, there's no bleeding procedure on this. You just have to let the fuel system bleed itself out. So no big deal if you notice that crank's a little bit longer than normal. So at this point, we just put everything back together. For starters, we're gonna go ahead and put this noise insulation back on top of the engine now. It's probably gonna be the easiest time to do it, because this thing kind of sucks to put on when you've put everything back together. It is your choice as to whether you want to leave this off or not. However, I do caution you that if you choose to leave off that noise insulator, you're going to hear a lot of injection noise inside the passenger cabin. So if that's not something that you're willing to live with, put that back on. Next up, we have a bunch of 10mm screws that secure this cover here in the rear. Next up, we're going to reinstall our cross brace. We're going to start all the bolts by hand. These are E18. We're going to torque these to spec. The reason for that is if you just run them down by hand, you do risk the chance of these loosening up over time, and you're going to hear a really terrible rattle. So I do recommend following the recommended torque spec for those bolts. Torque spec for these is 56 plus 90. Put our covers back on for the bolt access holes up here at the cowl cover windshield cowl. And I'm gonna slide in these pieces here. Make sure the locks are basically twisted, so they shouldn't be like that, otherwise we're gonna have a hell of a time trying to install this. And when you're turning them, you'll kind of feel the locking gauge is almost like a detent. If you don't feel anything, that means the cover is not lined up with the cowl cover there. And then we have this rubber gasket, which is kind of a pain to install, if I'm being honest. You have to make sure that this groove here lines up with that all the way around. So it's just kind of a matter of pushing it into place and working it. Now I'll go ahead and reinstall the strut covers there, and it kind of wraps around the seal here. So it should look like one cohesive piece when it's all back together. Got a self-expanding rivet that goes there. And now we got this cable that we need to put into this special channel that runs all the way across this gasket. Using a flathead screwdriver to pry that seal back also helps a little bit. And lastly, we're going to reinstall the engine cover because this is an external wastegate car. We do need to hook up these vacuum connections back to the wastegate actuator solenoid and the wastegate, or the wastegate vacuum supply. This is our supply line back here. So that's how you go about replacing a valve cover gasket on all the associated seals on an N20 or N26 powered BMW. As you can see, it's a pretty involved process simply because you have to remove the high pressure fuel system, the fuel rail itself, and all those other items. There is a lot of that stuff in the way. The hardest part about it, truthfully, at least for me, was removing the vacuum pump at the back of the engine. But with that little stubby T40 torque socket from CTA, and a 12mm ratcheting wrench, that was way easier than it normally would have been. And honestly, if you're taking on this job, you probably want to have that little T40 socket. But as you can see in the video, it's not that terrible of a job. It really looks a lot worse than it is once you get into there. The labor rates on these things will vary from a BMW shop to an independent to maybe a dealership. So if you got a quote for doing this job and you want to save some money, this is definitely something you could take on yourself. But we hope you learned something in this video. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment box below. We'll definitely get back to you. Hit that like button if you liked the video. Also hit subscribe. We got lots more automotive content on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.